Edinburgh of the Seven Seas is a small settlement in the South Atlantic and officially the capital of the entire Tristan da Cunha territory. Today, fewer than 250 people live there, and that's literally the entire population of the island and the whole archipelago. In practice, the entire town is just a single main road, a small port, a few public buildings, and houses that never rise higher than 2 stories. But the residents rarely call it a town. Most of them simply use one word: the settlement. Edinburgh of the Seven Seas sits on the island of Tristan da Cunha, widely considered the most remote inhabited island in the world. The nearest inhabited land, St. Helena, lies more than 2,400 kilometers away. Africa is about 2,800 kilometers away, and South America is even farther. The archipelago itself consists of 6 islands, but only one of them is inhabited. The rest remain empty, or in the case of Gough Island, are occupied only by a small meteorological station staffed by a handful of researchers. Only a few ships reach the island each year, usually from Cape Town. The journey takes about a week, though rough ocean conditions often make it longer. There are no regular supply routes and no backup plans. In practice, that means everything the island cannot produce locally, from fuel and medicine to spare parts, has to arrive by ship, and sometimes people wait months. That's why the island has 1 store, 1 hospital, 1 post office, and 1 bar, which also serves as a center of social life. The island itself is actually the summit of a massive volcano called Queen Mary's Peak, rising straight from the ocean floor and shaping much of the local climate. It brings strong winds, heavy humidity, and weather that can change several times in a single day. In 1961, this same volcano erupted and destroyed a large part of the settlement, forcing every resident to evacuate to the United Kingdom. 2 years later, however, most of them made a surprising decision. They returned and rebuilt their homes almost from scratch. So if this place is so remote, so difficult to reach, and so demanding to live in, why does anyone choose to live here permanently? And perhaps even more interesting, why can't you move there today, even if you wanted to? Terrain and geography. The island's coastline looks exactly like what you would expect from a volcano rising straight out of the ocean. Steep cliffs, sometimes hundreds of meters high, drop directly into the water. There are no beaches, no gentle slopes, and almost no places where a boat could safely land. In fact, almost the entire island is inaccessible. There's only one exception, a small, relatively flat area on the northwestern coast, and that's exactly where Edinburgh of the Seven Seas was built. Not because anyone thought it was a perfect place to settle, but because it was the only place on the island that was even remotely suitable for living. Everywhere else was either too steep, too wet, or too exposed to the powerful waves of the Atlantic to build anything permanent. The island's location adds another challenge. Tristan da Cunha lies very close to the belt of powerful winds known as the Roaring Forties. Strong westerly winds that circle the southern hemisphere and regularly bring massive weather fronts with them. On large continents, they're just one factor among many. But here, on a tiny island in the middle of the ocean, their effects are much stronger. The weather changes quickly, often without warning. Planning anything far in advance can feel less like strategy and more like optimism. And very quickly, the weather starts to dictate everyday life. Can fishermen safely go out to sea today? Can a supply ship dock without risking disaster? Will the potatoes in the fields even survive another week? On Tristan da Cunha, there are very few decisions you can postpone. Either something can be done right now, or it has to wait until conditions decide to cooperate. And yet, the same ocean that makes life so difficult is also what makes life here possible. The cold, nutrient-rich waters surrounding the archipelago create ideal conditions for marine life. For the island's residents, one species turned out to be especially important: the Tristan rock lobster, a local lobster that has become the backbone of the island's economy. Thanks to it, the island earns the money it needs to import fuel, medicine, and everything else that cannot be grown, built, or repaired locally. Neighboring islands. Tristan da Cunha is not actually a single island, but the center of a small archipelago. The closest one is Inaccessible Island, a name that is quite literal. The island is little more than an extinct volcano surrounded by steep cliffs, and several ships throughout history have tried to reach it, with very unfortunate results. Because of this, the island has remained almost completely untouched and is now listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is also the only place in the world where the inaccessible island rail lives, the smallest flightless bird on Earth. Right next to it lies Nightingale Island. There's no permanent settlement there, but the people of Tristan da Cunha have been traveling there for generations to hunt and collect seabird eggs. It is one of the most important bird sanctuaries in the South Atlantic, home to millions of birds, including massive colonies of rockhopper penguins. The most distant island in the group is Gough Island. It is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but the only people who live there are a small team operating a meteorological station. No one lives there permanently, and no one seems to be planning to. As a result, Edinburgh of the Seven Seas is not just a remote settlement at the edge of the world. It is the only place in the entire archipelago where humans have managed to live, and, more importantly, chosen to stay. But that raises an obvious question. How did anyone end up here in the first place and decide that this was a good place to build a life? History of the island settlement. After its discovery in 1506 by a Portuguese admiral, the island remained little more than a point on maritime maps for centuries. Sailors knew it existed, but its steep cliffs, unpredictable weather, and a lack of safe landing spots made most of them think twice about getting any closer. For the most part, it was simply a place of seals and seabirds, a location ships might visit briefly to collect fresh water or supplies before continuing their journey. The first attempt at permanent settlement was just as unusual as the island itself. In 1810, an American from Salem, Massachusetts named Jonathan Lambert arrived with a few companions and rather confidently declared himself the ruler of the island. The idea was ambitious, the plan less so. A few years later, Lambert and several of his men drowned in a fishing accident, and the entire project collapsed before it could truly begin. In hindsight, it was less the start of a settlement and more of a false start. The real story of a permanent community on Tristan da Cunha began for a completely different reason. Not because someone dreamed of living in isolation, but because of political paranoia. In 1816, when Napoleon Bonaparte was being held in exile on the nearby island of St. Helena, the British Empire began to worry the French might attempt a rescue mission. Their concern was that Tristan da Cunha could potentially be used as a staging point for such an operation. So the British decided to act first. They formally occupied the archipelago and stationed a small military garrison on the island. The goal was simple: make sure that neither the French nor anyone else would try to use Tristan da Cunha as a strategic base. On paper, the plan made sense. In reality, it soon became clear that Napoleon was not going anywhere, and that this remote island had little interest in participating in global politics. Just a year later, the decision was made to withdraw the garrison, and that's when the story took an unexpected turn. One of the soldiers, a Scottish corporal named William Glass, asked permission to remain on the island, not alone, but with his wife, 2 children, and a few other people. The British authorities agreed, probably assuming it was a temporary whim. They were very wrong. Glass became the informal leader of the growing settlement, which in a single moment transformed from a military outpost into something like a social experiment. Over the following decades, people arrived to Tristan da Cunha who had never planned to live there at all. Shipwreck survivors, sailors, whalers, Englishmen, Italians, Dutchmen, Americans. Some arrived by misfortune, some by chance, and some simply decided that since they were already there, they might as well stay. One problem appeared rather quickly, and it was a very practical one. There were plenty of men, but almost no women. A bachelor community at the end of the world has obvious limitations, so the residents did what seemed most logical at the time. They asked the captain of a passing ship to bring wives from St. Helena, and that is how the foundation of the island society were formed. This unusual mix of different origins combined with a very small population eventually created a remarkably cohesive culture, a community built on cooperation and shared resources. There were no large differences in wealth and no clear social classes. Even today, the entire settlement of Edinburgh of the Seven Seas is built around just 7 family names. Glass, Green, Hagen, Lavarello, Repetto, Rogers, and Swain. If you live on Tristan da Cunha, there's a good chance you're related to someone else on the island, even if you're not entirely sure how. Development of the island. The 19th century was a period of slow but steady development for the island. The 20th century, however, brought the greatest test in its history. In October 1961, the ground began to shake. Queen Mary's Peak, the volcano that had loomed over the island for generations, finally erupted. A new volcanic cone appeared almost overnight, right in the potato fields, just a few minutes from the settlement. The entire population of the island, exactly 264 people at the time, had to be evacuated. First, they were moved to a nearby island, and then eventually all the way to the United Kingdom. For the first time in their lives, the people of Tristan da Cunha suddenly found themselves in a world that worked very differently. Traffic, television, money, shops, paperwork, and bureaucracy. For people who had grown up in a small community built on cooperation and a largely cash-free way of life, it was nothing short of a cultural shock. Many observers believe this would be the end of Edinburgh of the Seven Seas. After all, why would anyone choose to return from modern Britain to a harsh volcanic island in the middle of the ocean? Why give up comfort, healthcare, and opportunity when you can start a completely new life somewhere else? But one thing had been underestimated: the deep connection people felt to the place they had called home for generations, the settlement. And that connection turned out to be far stronger than anyone expected. Return to the island. So when they were finally given a choice, the decision came quickly and with little hesitation. The residents voted to return. In 1963, most of them boarded a ship once again and set off on the long journey across the Atlantic. This time, not into the unknown, but back home. And it's worth remembering, these people had seen modern Britain of the 1960s with its comfort, opportunities, and completely different pace of life. Yet, they still chose to return to a remote volcanic island in the middle of the ocean. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. What life on the island looks like today. So what does life look like today in the most isolated community in the world? Today, around 250 people live in Edinburgh of the Seven Seas. The island has a single school that educates all children, from preschoolers to teenagers. There's also a small hospital with a resident doctor who has to be ready for almost anything, because the nearest medical evacuation can mean several days of travel by ship. There's a post office that acts as the island's window to the world, and a store where people buy whatever arrives by sea. The heart of social life is the Albatross Bar, the island's only pub. This is where the entire settlement gathers to celebrate, meet friends, or simply catch up with each other. Alongside lobster fishing, which is what the island is famous for, every family also maintains its own potato field in a shared farming area outside the settlement. People raise cattle and sheep, fish, repair houses, sew and knit. Being multi-skilled here isn't a hobby, it's a necessity. Most residents have an official job, for example in administration, the processing plant, or maintaining infrastructure. But at the same time, they also need to act as farmers, builders, or mechanics whenever the situation demands it. So why would anyone choose to live like this? The advantages of life on an isolated island. The greatest advantage of life on Tristan da Cunha is a strong sense of safety and community. Crime simply doesn't exist here. People don't lock their doors, car keys are often left in the ignition, and children run freely around the settlement without supervision. Because in a way, every adult feels responsible for every child. In a place where everyone is either family or a neighbor they've known since birth, responsibility for others isn't just an idea or a slogan. It's simply part of everyday life. There are no traffic jams, no long commutes, and none of the constant stress that defies life in most large cities. In exchange for limited choices and fewer conveniences, the people of Edinburgh of the Seven Seas gain something that is incredibly rare today: a real sense of belonging and peace. If that sounds appealing, there's one important thing to understand. You can't simply move here. The community is very aware of how fragile it is. The island is not looking for new residents. It has no immigration program, and there's no way to try life at the end of the world. The right to live here belongs almost exclusively to people who were born on the island. There are a few rare exceptions, mostly for practical reasons. Doctors, teachers, and other specialists sometimes come for fixed-term contracts. Marriage to an island resident can open the door to permanent residence, but even then, the decision is not automatic. It must be approved by the local council. This isn't about hostility toward the outsiders. It's simple practicality. The island has limited resources, a delicate ecosystem, and a tightly connected social structure that could easily be disrupted by even a small number of newcomers. The community is also aging, and statistics show that the population has slowly been declining. As recently as 2016, nearly 300 people live here. If you look only at the numbers, the future of the world's most isolated settlement may seem uncertain. But in this case, the word isolation can be misleading. Because while Tristan da Cunha may be far from the rest of the world, its residents are closer to one another than most people anywhere else. And that creates a level of safety and peace that can't be measured by distance or the number of airline connections. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.